The deck pitches beneath your feet, a living thing in pain. Salt water slaps your face hard enough to sting, and the wind's howl steals your breath before you can curse it. Lantern light flails across wet timbers, catching the pale whites of terrified eyes. Above, the sails balloon and shudder like lungs on the edge of bursting. Somewhere in the darkness, a mast snaps with the sound of a bone giving way. And over it all, the deep, low moan of the ocean, as if the whole world were warning you to turn back. If you've ever let yourself drift into a story at night, chasing the pulse of waves and the whispers of old maps, you know the ocean can carry more than ships. It can carry secrets. Stay with me now, and let the tide carry us both into a place between memory and myth. If the sea has you, leave a like, share with a night owl, and subscribe so the next chapter finds you in your sleep. The wind shifts, and so does your fate. Somewhere west, unseen, waits the first shadow of land you were never meant to find. The storm arrived without ceremony, like a blade sliding quietly from its sheath. One moment the sky was bruised but steady. The next, it split open into a writhing sheet of black and silver. For sailors trained in the rough moods of the Bay of Biscay, this was something else entirely, a violence that felt personal, deliberate. By the first hour after sunset, the fleet that had left La Rochelle together was scattered like seeds in a plowed field. On the flagship Sainte Marie, the commander barked orders to reduce sail, his voice nearly drowned in the crack and hiss of canvas. Men hauled lines until their hands blistered, but the wind had found a rhythm none could match. Wave crests, pale and sharp-edged, loomed higher than the cross at the mainmast, then collapsed in roaring applause against the hull. Somewhere below deck, lashed to an iron ring in the cargo hold, lay the chest. It was heavy, not just in weight but in consequence. Those who had touched it during the loading did so with a silent crossing of themselves, an odd gesture for men already sworn to God. The chest held more than the gold coin of their order. It carried a ledger of debts and favors owed, relics whose value could not be tallied, and the one artifact that even the most weathered knight would not speak of aloud. The Sainte Marie took a swell broadside, and the world leaned. A cask broke loose, rolling through the gloom like a drunkard looking for the door. Above deck, the stars were gone. The commander's eyes searched the void where the turtle shell map would have guided him. A chart not of coastlines, but of currents and constellations older than any European claim. Without those pinprick fires overhead, they were as blind as moles under earth. The wind shifted again harder from the east, pressing the ship's prow toward an invisible horizon. The commander's mind flashed to the others, the smaller galleys, the supply bark carrying extra grain and salted meat. No signal lights were visible through the storm wall. Even the nearest vessels were gone, swallowed without splash or cry. Hours became a measure of endurance. Rain drummed on shields and helmets where they hung along the bulwarks, as if the sky itself were marching against them. Sailcloth tore, first in strips, then in great banners that snapped free and vanished into the dark. Every man aboard understood that once the mast was gone, they would be next. Somewhere in that chaos, a strange calm settled over the commander. He thought, not of France or of the king's prisons that would have been their fate had they stayed, but of the old oath given in a candlelit chapel years before. We do not return. It had sounded like bravado then, a defiance against enemies. Tonight it felt like prophecy. Near midnight, the ship's boy, no more than 14 and half wild from fear, clambered to the quarterdeck with eyes wide as moons. "Light!" he shouted, though the word was whipped thin by the gale. Off the port bow, a dull glow trembled on the horizon, low and steady. Not lightning, it lacked the violence. Not another ship, too broad for a lantern, too constant for a torch. The commander lifted his chin into the rain, tasting salt and the metallic bite of fear. There should be nothing there. No port, no beacon, nothing but the emptiness that swallows men and ships whole. Yet the light pulsed, as though answering the beat of his heart. "Hold course!" he roared, though the helmsman's knuckles were already white on the tiller. The compass spun lazy circles, drunk on the storm. Navigation now was instinct, a conversation between the hull and the water it rode. The night wore on, the glow never growing brighter, but never vanishing. In its presence, the wind seemed to ease, or perhaps the crew had grown numb to its teeth. When dawn finally bled into the sky, pale and uncertain, the storm lay behind them, like a memory one tries to shake off. Before them stretched an ocean as calm as the inside of a prayer. The men turned, searching for sails on the horizon, but there were none. The fleet was gone. Whether sunk, scattered to the corners of the sea, or swallowed by that night's wrath, no one could guess. Only the Sainte Marie remained, her timbers groaning but afloat, the chest still bound in the hold. And there, at the far edge of sight, was land, a smudge of green and gold against the silver blue of morning. Too large for a sandbar, too lush for a barren rock. The commander stared at it as if seeing a vision half promised, half feared. The turtle shell map whispered of currents that led west to places unnamed. Perhaps this was one. The crew, restless and hollow-eyed, awaited orders. Turn back toward a Europe that might already brand them traitors and thieves, or steer toward the unknown, where the sea might yet claim them, but not before they learned its secret. The commander's hand went to the hilt at his side, not to draw it, but to feel the worn leather grip. The blade had served in holy lands and heathen markets, but it had never pointed him wrong. He lifted his arm, slow as sunrise, and the prow swung toward the green. No cheer rose from the men, only a low murmur, as if the ship itself sighed in relief. The wind shifted to follow, a soft push now instead of a shove. Beneath them, the ocean's color changed, deepening toward turquoise. In the rigging, a gull cried, a sound no one had heard for weeks. The Sainte Marie slid forward, her wake a brief scar in the vast calm, toward a shore that had not been inked on any European map. Whatever lay ahead, fresh water, hostile spears, gods with new names, it would not be the gallows in Paris. And in the commander's mind, that old oath whispered again, but differently this time. We do not return, because we have arrived. The scent of land came first, green rot and blooming things, the musk of earth washed clean by rain. It filled the men's lungs, mingling with the last sting of salt. Above, the gull wheeled once more, then vanished inland, as if carrying word ahead. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the green smudge had become a wall of trees, their tops burning gold in the new light. Somewhere behind that wall, rivers sang, and stones remembered. The commander did not know yet that their arrival would leave marks in those stones, marks that would sleep for centuries under root and vine. For now he only knew the sea had turned to night and given them back to morning. The morning after the storm felt hollow, like the silence in a chapel after the congregation has left. The sea, so recently a raging choir of waves and wind, now lay smooth as hammered pewter under a pale, cloudless sky. The Sainte Marie drifted with a limp mainsail, its rigging creaking softly, every sound suddenly magnified without the roar of the gale. Men moved slowly, stunned by the sudden peace, as though they feared a single careless word might wake the storm again. It was then they began to count the missing. One by one, the names of ships were spoken aloud: Saint-Étienne, La Colombe, Saint-Christophe, Notre-Dame-des-Vents, each name hanging in the air like an unanswered prayer. Through the spyglass, the horizon was empty in every direction. Not a fleck of white sail or mast-top pennant to break the monotony of silver blue. The fleet that had left La Rochelle in disciplined formation, 11 ships strong, was now reduced to 1. The absence was impossible to accept. Ships did not simply vanish without wreckage, without a splinter or a drifting cask to mark their grave. Yet the ocean offered no debris, no gulls circling a feast. It was as if the other vessels had been quietly plucked from the water by some unseen hand. Below decks, the inventory was grim. The storm had claimed 2 casks of fresh water and half the salted fish. Several barrels of flour had split their seams, the wet grain already fermenting in the heat. The carpenter reported that the foremast was cracked, where the grain of the wood had twisted under strain. It would hold, but only if the weather stayed merciful. In the cargo hold, the chest was still there. Its iron bands were beaded with condensation, the lock unbroken. A young knight named Geoffroy stood watch over it, his tabard soaked and stiff with salt. He had not left his post through the storm. The others whispered that he had lashed himself to the chest, though no one dared to ask. The commander descended into the hold, the lantern's glow revealing his hollowed eyes and salt-crusted beard. He knelt beside the chest, placing a hand on the cold iron. In his mind, the weight of what lay within seemed heavier than ever now that the rest of the fleet, and their share of its burden, were gone. Up on deck, the men whispered in knots. Some spoke of divine judgment, others of sorcery. One grizzled archer swore he had seen lights in the waves during the worst of the storm, blue as a church window at midnight. Another said he had heard a voice beneath the wind, calling in a tongue he didn't know yet somehow understood. Come west. The commander listened to none of it. He stood at the rail, scanning the emptiness, weighing the impossible. Return east and hope to find what remained of the fleet, or steer into the unknown, carrying the order's most dangerous secrets to a place no enemy could follow. He knew the truth even as he pretended to consider. The fleet was gone, and so was any chance of retracing their steps with certainty. The ship's navigator, a lean man named Bernard, approached with the turtle shell map wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it on the deck, the grooves of its etched lines catching the morning light. It was no ordinary chart. Instead of familiar coasts, it depicted streams and swirls that only the deep currents would recognize. Star patterns were marked in fine scratches, some familiar to European eyes, others foreign and unsettling. Bernard tapped one spiral on the western edge, where current and constellation met like 2 halves of a clasp. If the storm drove us here, he said quietly, this is where we are meant to go. The commander studied the mark. There was no land drawn there, only open water. But the old oath rang again in his ears. We do not return. In its shadow, Even the absence of the fleet began to feel less like a loss and more like a narrowing of destiny. By midday, the men had stopped scanning the horizon. They worked instead to repair torn rigging and patch the worst of the sail damage. The carpenter reinforced the foremast with an iron collar hammered from spare fittings. The cook boiled what remained of the flour into a thick paste, drying it in the sun to salvage as hard biscuit. Every action felt measured, as though the crew understood that each small repair and ration might buy them one more day's journey toward an unseen shore. That night, the commander called the crew together. The lanterns swayed in the warm breeze, casting their shadows long across the deck. He spoke, without ornament, without promises. The fleet was gone. There would be no turning back. They would follow the currents and stars, as the map instructed, even if it carried them beyond the edge of any known chart. Some men bowed their heads in silent assent. Others exchanged wary glances. But no one spoke against the decision. The sea had already shown what defiance might cost. When the meeting ended, Geoffroy remained by the chest, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The commander joined him, the two standing in companionable silence. Somewhere far out in the dark, the water shifted. Not the restless chop of the tide, but a slow rolling swell, as though something vast moved beneath them. The commander felt it through the soles of his feet, an almost imperceptible pressure, and in it, a direction. By morning, the Sainte Marie would be underway again, leaving no wake to speak of, her course bent toward a mystery. Behind her lay nothing but water and absence. Ahead, perhaps, the first shadow of land unmarked by any European hand. The ocean, it seemed, had erased their footprints. Now, they would have to write new ones. And somewhere under the calm surface, the current that held their keel felt less like chance and more like an invitation. Night settled over the Sainte Marie like a hood, closing out the last thin streaks of red that had clung to the horizon. The crew moved in a muted rhythm, coiling lines, checking knots, lowering the patched sail to half-mast for the night drift. The ship's timbers still groaned from the storm, but the water against the hull was a gentle hush now, as if the ocean itself was resting. The commander stood on the quarterdeck, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing down at the oilcloth-wrapped object Bernard carried under one arm. They descended together into the great cabin, where a single lantern swung from a hook overhead, throwing amber circles across the table. Bernard unrolled the oilcloth, revealing the turtle shell map. It was larger than a man's torso, the natural dome of the shell etched with an intricate network of lines, swirls, and small puncture marks. At first glance, it might have been a piece of idle artistry, but the commander had long since learned its language. Each spiral marked a gyre, each deep cut a prevailing current. The pinpoints were not random. Some matched the positions of familiar stars, others charted constellations no European mariner could name. The crew believed it came from the east, perhaps carried back to the Holy Land during the Crusades, and passed in secret through the Order's inner circles. But Bernard told a different story. He claimed the shell had been in the treasury since before the founding of the Order, its origin whispered only in the Oath Hall, where initiates stood barefoot on cold stone and swore fealty. Whether that was truth or myth hardly mattered. The map had never failed them. The commander ran his finger along a wide current flowing westward from their likely position. It curved tightened, then split into two smaller flows, the southern one spiraling toward a cluster of marks that looked almost like a child's attempt at islands. "There," Bernard murmured, tapping the cluster, "where water and sky meet. Where the shell says we'll find shelter." The commander's jaw tightened. The decision was his alone, but he felt the weight of 100 invisible hands pressing him forward. Turning back east would mean weeks of sailing against the currents, with dwindling supplies and no certainty of finding the others. West meant embracing the unknown, trusting the shell as their only compass. He closed his eyes and heard again the words of the old oath, spoken in the low echo of a chapel vault years before. "We do not return." That night the phrase had sounded like defiance. Now it was a vow, heavy and binding. He looked at Bernard. "Call the men," he said. They gathered on deck. The lanterns hung along the bulwark, casting long shadows across the planks. The night air was warm, tinged with the scent of salt, and something faintly floral drifting from the west. The commander laid the turtle shell on a coil of rope where all could see it. "This," he began, touching the etched dome, "has guided us farther than any king's chart or sailor's tale. It has brought us through waters no other fleet has crossed, and now it will take us further still." He paused, letting the silence draw tight. "The fleet is gone. We are alone. The way back is uncertain. The way forward is unmarked by any Christian hand. But it is the way we will take." The men shifted uneasily, eyes flicking from the shell to the dark horizon. A few murmured prayers. The commander's gaze found each of them in turn. "We will guard the chest until our last breath. We will follow this map until our sails rot from the mast. We will not turn back, not for fear, not for want, not for the promise of safe harbor. The oath we swore binds us still. Non revertimur." Jeffro stepped forward first, his youth shadowed by the hard lines storm and hunger had carved into him. He knelt, resting his palm on the shell. "I swear," he said simply. One by one, the others followed. Some touched the shell. Others pressed a hand to the hilt of their sword or the cross at their neck. When the last man had spoken, the commander covered the shell again and returned it to Bernard's keeping. The ritual was done, but its echo hung over the deck like the scent of rain before a storm. Through the small hours, the Sainte Marie drifted westward under the pull of the current, her patched sail catching just enough wind to keep her nose pointed toward the unseen land. The sea was unnaturally calm, the stars overhead crisp and bright. Bernard used them to confirm their course, noting how certain unfamiliar constellations lined up perfectly with the grooves on the turtle shell. Near dawn, a pod of dolphins appeared off the starboard bow, their sleek backs breaking the water in graceful arcs. To the men, it felt like a sign. In the Holy Land, the dolphin had been a rare sight, a creature of distant oceans. Here it seemed to escort them, cutting through the surface with a speed and certainty that made even the most doubtful sailor believe they were headed somewhere worth finding. The commander allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The storm had stripped them bare of numbers, of provisions, of certainty. But in doing so, it had burned away hesitation. They had one ship, one map, one oath, and that, perhaps, was enough. By mid-morning, a faint smudge appeared on the far horizon. At first, it could have been a trick of the light, a seam where sky and sea blurred. But as the sun climbed, the smudge sharpened into a line, then into a jagged shape. A murmur ran along the deck. Land. The commander did not allow himself to smile, but his grip on the rail tightened. The shell had not lied. He looked back once at the empty eastern horizon, where no sail broke the clean line of the sea. Then he turned his face west, toward the green shadow that waited. The oath whispered again in his mind. Not a warning now, but a welcome. We do not return. The dolphins leapt once more, then vanished ahead, as if slipping into a harbor only they could see. The Sainte Marie followed, the turtle-shell map resting once more in its oilcloth shroud, the men moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with orders. Somewhere beyond that green edge, there would be water to drink, food to hunt, dangers to face. But there would also be a place to leave their mark, one the sea could not wash away. For now the ship sailed on, bound not just for land, but for the page of history no one had yet written. By the time the Sainte Marie drew within sight of the coastline, the morning sun had lifted high enough to burn the mist from the water. What emerged was not the gentle slope of a beach or the familiar outlines of a fishing village, but a sheer barricade of green, an unbroken wall of trees rising from the edge of the sea. The canopy shimmered in the heat, each leaf catching light like a coin before letting it spill back into shadow. The sailors stared in a hush that was part awe, part unease. They had seen forest in their own lands, but nothing so dense, so alive. Here the trees seemed not to grow from the earth so much as to erupt from it, their roots gripping pale limestone ledges that thrust outward like teeth. Vines as thick as a man's wrist hung in tangled ropes from the upper branches, trailing down to brush the water's surface. The air smelled of sap and salt, and something sweetly rotten, a perfume of life and decay intermingled. The commander ordered the sail dropped and the oars shipped to slow their approach. The shoreline here was a treacherous lace of mangrove roots, black and knotted, reaching down into the shallows. The tide was falling, revealing mud flats studded with shells the size of a man's hand. Herons with knife-like beaks picked their way between them, indifferent to the human intrusion. Bernard stood at the bow with the turtle-shell map in hand, though its etched spirals offered no detail of the shore, only the general promise of land in this quarter of the sea. His other hand shaded his eyes as he scanned for a break in the green wall, some opening where they might pass without tearing the hull to splinters. It was the youngest sailor, Alain, who spotted it, a darker patch where the roots thinned and the water glimmered with a deeper blue. A channel. The commander gave the signal, and the oars dipped in unison, their wooden blades stirring the shallows into cloudy swirls. As they slipped into the channel, the temperature seemed to climb. The air grew heavy, clinging to skin and cloth. From somewhere deep in the foliage came the drone of unseen insects and the distant cough of an animal. Leaves the size of shields leaned over the water, their undersides pale and veined. The men rowed on, sweat darkening the collars of their tunics. The channel curved gently, the green wall pressing in on either side until the sky was reduced to a ragged strip above. Then, without warning, it opened into a broad, sheltered lagoon. The water here was a shade of turquoise that seemed almost unnatural, its surface glassy except for the ripples their oars made. Coral heads glowed beneath, their edges teeming with darting fish in colors that looked painted by some impatient god. They let the ship drift, anchored by the stillness. On the far side of the lagoon, the forest climbed a slope of pale rock that caught the sunlight and reflected it in blinding shards. Somewhere behind that ridge, A dark plume of smoke rose in a thin column, perfectly vertical in the windless air. The commander saw it first. He pointed, but said nothing for several breaths. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Whether they would greet strangers with trade or with spears was another matter entirely. The crew's reaction split along the fault lines of hope and fear. Some whispered of fresh water, of fruit and game. Others muttered about ambush, about poisoned arrows and gods who demanded foreign blood. Geoffroy, standing watch near the chest, said nothing at all. His gaze was fixed on the tree line as if daring it to move. The commander ordered a landing party to prepare, though the tide's drop made it impossible to bring the ship right to shore. They would use the small boat, rowing across the last 100 yards to the pale sand visible at the base of the ridge. The rest of the crew would remain aboard to guard the chest and the ship's stores. As the landing party readied themselves, checking sword edges, stringing bows, filling water flasks, Bernard crouched at the ship's rail, studying the lagoon floor. His eyes narrowed. "Look there," he said to Alain, pointing toward a shape half hidden by coral. It was stone, not the tumbled boulder of a natural reef, but a cut block, its faces worn yet still bearing the straight lines of a mason's chisel. It rested at an angle, one corner buried in sand. The commander joined them, peering down into the water. There were more blocks nearby, some overgrown with seaweed, others standing proud of the bottom like the foundation of a long-forgotten wall. "It's a building," Bernard said, his voice low. Or was. That knowledge sat heavily on them. It meant they were not the first to find this lagoon, nor the first to leave their mark upon it. Whoever had come before was gone now, their work claimed by the sea. The sailors glanced at one another, each wondering if the Sainte Marie might one day join those ruins, reduced to a curiosity for some future set of eyes. The small boat pushed off, oars dipping in slow unison. The water was so clear they could see their own shadows moving over the sandy bottom, past the coral, past the carved stones. The shore ahead shimmered in the heat, a line of pale sand caught between the turquoise water and the dark green rise of the forest. When the keel grated softly on the sand, the commander stepped out first, boots sinking slightly. The sand here was fine, almost white, and littered with shells and the bleached bones of small fish. Above the tide line, driftwood lay in tangles, some pieces gnawed smooth by the sea. The forest began abruptly, the first line of trees rising like sentries. The air was different here, still heavy, but layered with scents, resin, wet earth, flowers unseen but insistent. A bird shrieked overhead, its call echoing oddly between the trees. The commander scanned the edge of the forest but saw no movement beyond the sway of leaves. Behind him, Bernard bent to examine the sand. "Footprints," he said. The commander joined him. The prints were faint, softened by the breeze, but unmistakable. Human, barefoot, and recent. They led from the forest's edge to the waterline and back again. The commander straightened, his hand resting lightly on the hilt at his side. Whoever had made those prints might be watching them now, unseen among the trees. The thought sharpened his senses, made the air feel thicker still. They would need water, food, and information, and they would need to earn them without igniting a conflict they could not win. The lagoon's serenity was a skin stretched over something deeper, something they could not yet name. For now, the landing party stood on the sand, the forest breathing in front of them. the ship waiting behind. Between the two lay the narrow path they would have to walk. One step into the green wall, one step into whatever fate waited beyond. The morning tide had receded further, leaving a wide band of damp sand that gleamed under the hard light. Every step the landing party took left its own dark impression, but it was not their own tracks that held their attention. It was the older ones, the ones they had seen upon arrival. Bernard crouched low again, his shadow falling over the faint depressions. They were narrow, the toes splayed slightly, the heel deep in a way that suggested a firm, confident stride. The distance between prints hinted at a quick pace, perhaps someone accustomed to running on this surface. The edges of the impressions had softened under the breeze, but they were intact enough to be read. "These were made no more than a day ago," Bernard said. His voice was not loud, yet it carried the weight of certainty. "And not by us." The commander stood over him, gaze shifting between the tree line and the lagoon. The breeze was moving through the upper canopy, sending a ripple of silver-green light across the leaves, but nothing stirred at ground level. It was the kind of stillness that could belong to emptiness, or to eyes waiting for a sign. Geoffroy's hand rested on his sword hilt. He scanned the tree line as if willing it to part. "Bare feet," he murmured, "and small. Women or youths?" His tone made it neither reassurance nor warning. Alain, standing closest to the waterline, found something else. A scatter of small shells arranged in a rough ring, half buried in the sand. They were unlike the heavy scallops or mussels he knew. These were delicate, almost translucent, streaked with pale rose and cream. In the center of the ring was a patch of darker sand, as though a small fire had burned there and been extinguished quickly. Bernard joined him, brushing the sand aside with careful fingers. Beneath, he found fragments of charcoal, some still smelling faintly of smoke despite the sea air. He held one up. "Campfire," he said. "They watched the water from here." The commander considered that. It meant whoever had made the footprints had chosen this exact stretch of shore, perhaps as a vantage point to see out over the lagoon. They might have watched the Sainte Marie glide in through the channel. If so, they would already know the newcomers were here. The sand bore other stories. Further along the shore, just beyond the driftwood line, Bernard spotted a series of deeper impressions, irregular, staggered, as though made by something heavier. When he brushed them clear, the outline was unmistakable, a clawed paw, each print the size of a man's hand. "Jaguar," Geoffroy said flatly. The word dropped into the air like a stone into still water. None of them had seen such a creature, but they had heard tales from sailors who had ventured farther south along the African coast, tales of great cats with gold and black hides, powerful enough to bring down a man in a single leap. The commander's jaw tightened. This was no gentle, empty island. The forest beyond the sand was alive with predators. Bernard straightened, brushing his hands on his tunic. "The tracks lead both ways," he said. "The human prints go into the forest. The jaguars come from it." No sign of struggle. It was a puzzle. If the two paths had crossed, the sand gave no hint of violence. Perhaps the beast had passed earlier, or perhaps it had shadowed the human from a distance, waiting. The commander turned to the others. "We'll follow the human trail," he said, "but no deeper than the first rise. We learn the lay of the land before we vanish into it." They moved toward the tree line, keeping a loose formation. The sand gave way to soil, rich and dark, laced with fallen leaves that crackled underfoot. The air changed immediately, denser, warmer, and layered with smells: wet earth, sap, and the faint musky note of animal. The prints became harder to follow on the leaf-strewn ground, but Bernard could still read them, pointing out where the weight had pressed through the debris to the soil below. The trail angled toward the base of the ridge where the smoke had been seen. Through breaks in the foliage, they caught glimpses of pale limestone mottled with lichen. The commander halted them at the first incline. From here the ground rose steeply, and the trees grew taller, their roots snaking over the stone. Above, the canopy opened just enough to let in shafts of sunlight, turning the air into a lattice of gold and green. They stood still, listening. Somewhere nearby, water moved, slow and steady, like the breath of the forest itself. It might be a stream or a spring. The commander made a note of it. Fresh water would be the key to staying here longer than a day. Then came another sound, the soft, rapid patter of something moving through the undergrowth. The men froze, hands on hilts and bowstrings. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Geoffroy's eyes scanned the shadows. He saw nothing, but felt, as did the others, that they were being measured from a distance. The commander raised his hand, signaling a return to the beach. They had learned enough for now. This shore was not abandoned, and whatever lived here, man or beast, was already aware of their presence. Back on the sand, the air felt almost cool compared to the forest's press. They retraced their path to the boat, pushing off into the lagoon. From this distance, the green wall looked impenetrable again, its secrets hidden behind the shimmer of leaves. As they rowed toward the Sainte Marie, Bernard glanced over the side. The pale blocks they had seen before were clearer in the midday light, their sharp edges a defiance against the coral's slow claiming. They seemed older now, as though they had been waiting for someone to notice. The commander did not look back at the shore until they were halfway across. When he did, the pale sand was empty, the footprints already blurring under the wind's touch, yet he could not shake the feeling that eyes still watched from the shade, following them out across the water. The chest waited in the hold, unchanged, but above it, on deck, the air was different now, more taut, the crew's glances sharper, their voices quieter. News of the prince and the fire spread in low exchanges. The green wall had gone from a vision of possibility to a threshold they would have to cross with care. Night would come quickly here, the commander knew. And in the dark, the distance between the sand and the forest would feel much smaller. By the time the Sainte Marie's boat returned to the ship, the sun was already lowering toward the tree line, its light softening from white to a molten gold. The lagoon was still, but the forest beyond the sand seemed to deepen in color as shadow began to pool between its trunks. From the deck, the green wall now looked less like a barrier and more like a living fortress, breathing slowly in the heat. The commander wasted no time. The landing party's report, footprints, the faint remains of a fire, the jaguar track, was shared in clipped sentences. Each detail drew a new ripple of unease through the crew. Sailors who had been mending rigging glanced toward the shore, as though expecting the trees themselves to advance. That night they kept the ship anchored in the lagoon center. The tide was gentle here, the hull rocking only slightly, but no one slept easily. The forest was never silent. Insects sawed their legs together in a steady chorus. Somewhere distant, a bird let out a repetitive, almost mocking call. Then, well after the moon had risen, a sound rolled across the water, low, guttural, and drawn out like the bow across a viol string. A jaguar's call. It was not the sharp roar of a lion, nor the high scream of a panther, but something stranger, more deliberate. It carried through the night air, fading and returning, until it seemed to circle the lagoon entirely. The men on deck exchanged glances, speaking only in whispers. The commander said nothing, but he stood at the rail long after the sound faded, his eyes fixed on the strip of sand glimmering in the moonlight. At first light, a small party went ashore again, not to advance into the forest, but to study the tracks more carefully. What they found made the night's unease settle deeper. The jaguar prints were fresher now, overlapping the older ones, the edges sharp where the claws had sunk in. Some led to the very edge of the tree line, only a dozen paces from where the humans' bare footprints had been. Bernard knelt to measure the span from heel pad to toe, nearly the length of his forearm. "A big one," he said quietly, "and not afraid." It was Alan who spotted the other sign, a collared peccary carcass, half hidden under palm fronds not far from the base of the ridge. The animal was intact, except for the gaping wound at its neck. Its blood had soaked into the earth in a dark fan, and the air above it was thick with flies. "Dragged here," Geoffroy observed, pointing to the trail in the dirt. "Not eaten yet. It'll come back for it." The commander considered the carcass in silence. It was a message of sorts, not written in words, but in the logic of predator and prey. Whether meant for other jaguars or for them, he could not say. They withdrew to the beach, the sense of being watched now heavier, more pointed. The forest seemed to lean toward them, its shadows stretching farther across the sand. In those shadows, anything could stand unseen. That afternoon, a pair of men were assigned to keep watch with bows ready, while others ferried casks of water from the lagoon to the ship. No one went alone, not even for a dozen steps. The task was slow under the heat, but the commander would not risk letting the crew grow careless. As the day wore on, the tide rose again, erasing the morning's tracks. By dusk, the beach looked untouched, a smooth band of white between sea and forest. Only those who had seen it earlier would know what had prowled there. Night brought the sound again. This time the jaguar's call came from nearer, and it was answered, fainter, farther away, but distinct. Two of them. The voices threaded through the insect chorus, never overlapping, as if speaking in turns. The men on deck tightened their grips on spear shafts and bowstrings, peering into the dark. The commander moved among them, speaking quietly, reminding them that the ship was their fortress here. The jaguars might patrol the forest's edge, but they would not swim to a deck bristling with armed men. Not yet. Still, he knew the cats had time on their side. Hunger, curiosity, or the simple defense of territory could all draw them closer. By the third day in the lagoon, the cats had not shown themselves in daylight. Their tracks appeared and vanished with the tide, sometimes accompanied by the scattered remains of smaller prey. Once, Bernard found a set of prints that began abruptly on bare sand, as if the cat had dropped from a tree rather than walked from the forest. The thought of such silent, vertical movement unsettled even the most hardened knight. It was in the evening of that third day that something shifted, As the sun bled down behind the ridge, a shape appeared at the tree line, so still at first that it seemed part of the shadows. Then it moved, and the men on the ship saw the flash of a tawny coat patterned with rosettes dark as spilled ink. The jaguar stood with its head high, tail swaying lazily. Even at this distance, its eyes caught the fading light, throwing it back in cold gold. It looked directly at the ship for a long moment before turning to melt back into the green. The commander said nothing, but a part of him respected the animal's audacity. This was its domain. They were the intruders. Whatever happened next would be decided on terms the jaguar understood: patience, territory, and the balance between risk and reward. That night the calls were closer still. The men on watch swore they saw movement in the palms at the edge of the sand, but the darkness refused to give shape to anything certain. The commander ordered lanterns hung high and kept burning through the small hours, their glow drawing hard circles on the deck. The crew spoke in low voices about omens, some believing the jaguar to be a guardian spirit, others an ill sign that no treaty could be made here. Bernard, ever the pragmatist, reminded them that a hunter was a hunter, whether in fur or mail. But even he kept his bow strung when on deck. By dawn, the forest looked the same as it had on their first approach, a wall of green, dense and inscrutable. The only proof of the night's visitors was a set of new prints in the sand, leading to and from the place where the collared peccary carcass had been. It was gone now, claimed in the dark. The commander looked toward the ridge where smoke had once risen. If people lived there, they shared this place with the jaguars, navigating its dangers in ways the newcomers did not yet understand. To reach them, the crew would have to cross the same ground the cats claimed. For now, the jaguar's message was clear. The shore was not unguarded. And somewhere in that layered green, eyes still watched, measuring distance, patience, and the worth of prey. The morning began with a decision to seek fresh water inland. The lagoon's turquoise shimmer was a beauty that could not be drunk, and the rainwater casks aboard the Sainte Marie were falling to a level that made the commander's jaw tighten each time he checked. The landing party was chosen with care: Bernard, for his eye and memory of the land; Geoffroy, for his vigilance; Alain, for his light step; and 2 other seasoned sailors who could carry weight if the find was plentiful. They took the small boat to shore at first light, the sand still cool beneath their boots. The jaguar tracks from the previous day had softened in the night breeze, but they remained legible enough to remind the men they would not be alone. Moving past the driftwood and into the first rank of trees, the air thickened again, heavy with the forest's damp breath. The undergrowth was a tight weave of ferns, saplings, and vines, forcing them to slow their pace. It was Bernard who heard it first, a sound not of the forest's insect chorus or bird call, but a low, constant rush, muffled as though wrapped in cloth, water moving over stone. He tilted his head, gauging its direction, and led them toward it. The incline grew steeper underfoot, the soil dark and cool where it lay under a carpet of leaves. They broke through a tangle of creepers and found themselves staring at a limestone rise streaked with veins of white and ochre. In its center yawned a circular mouth, perfectly smooth around its rim, as though carved by some deliberate hand. Within, a shaft of crystalline water fell in a single, narrow sheet from the lip of an overhang far above, vanishing into a pool whose surface glowed blue from within. A cenote. The men stood in reverent silence, Even Geoffroy, who rarely let awe creep into his expression, allowed himself a slow intake of breath. The water was so clear they could see pale fish drifting lazily in the deeper reaches, their scales flashing silver when they turned. Tree roots dangled from the rock walls, drinking directly from the pool. Ellen was the first to kneel and taste it. The water was cool, sweeter than any from a cask. It washed the salt from his mouth and left a faint mineral trace on the tongue. He drank deeply, filled his flask, and stepped back to allow the others their turn. The commander knelt last. As he cupped the water in his palms, he noticed something just beneath the surface on the far side. A slab of stone darker than the limestone around it, set into the wall as though part of some old construction. He rose and walked the rim, crouching where the overhang shadow hid its detail. There, faint but undeniable, was a carving. Time and water had softened its edges, but the image was still clear. A stylized cross, whose arms flared outward, each tipped with a curling leaf. Around it spiraled bands of glyphs, unlike any script the commander knew. Bernard joined him, brushing a thin veil of moss away to reveal more of the pattern. "It's not Latin," Bernard murmured. "Not any script of Christendom." He traced the flared cross with one finger. "But this—" His voice trailed off. They both knew what it resembled, though neither wanted to speak the word aloud here. The others, busy filling flasks and skins, had not yet noticed. The commander decided not to draw their attention to it. Not now. Some knowledge was better carried quietly until its meaning could be weighed. He took a long drink from his filled flask, the cold seeping into his bones, and rose. Before they left, they noted the cenote's location carefully, marking a bent palm nearby with a shallow cut from Geoffroy's knife. This place was life itself, water in abundance, shaded and cool, hidden from view unless one knew where to listen. They could return to it as needed, so long as they kept it secret from any unfriendly eyes. On the trek back toward the shore, the forest seemed less oppressive. Perhaps it was the weight of the water skins on their backs, or perhaps the knowledge that they had found something enduring, an anchor point in an unfamiliar land. Still, the jaguar's absence was felt as keenly as its presence had been the day before. Every rustle in the canopy, every sway of a shadowed branch, was met with a glance over the shoulder. When they emerged from the tree line, the sun was high, burning white on the sand. The Sainte Marie sat anchored in the lagoon like a silver-scaled fish, its patched sails furled. From here the green wall seemed to fold back on itself, hiding the stone mouth and its cool blue heart. Back aboard, the water was poured into the casks, and the crew drank until their throats no longer burned. The commander gave no mention of the carving. That knowledge he kept as a stone in his pocket, weighty, persistent, and private. As the sun dropped toward the ridge, a thin column of smoke rose once more in the distance. This time he could not look at it without thinking of the cenote's cross, hidden in the shadow of stone and root. Perhaps the same hands that kept the fire also carved that symbol. Perhaps they too guarded water in this land. Night came with a chorus of insects and the distant, familiar cough of a jaguar. The commander stood at the rail, the taste of the cenote's water still ghosting his tongue. He wondered if the stone cross had been meant as a welcome or a warning. Either way, the jungle had given them its first gift. And like all true gifts, it carried a price that would be named later. It began with a shadow at the edge of the tree line. The sun was high, the sand between lagoon and forest burning underfoot, and the crew had been moving in cautious patterns, refilling casks, checking fishing lines, keeping watch for jaguars. Then Bernard saw the movement, not the sleek glide of an animal, but the slow, deliberate shift of a human figure stepping just far enough into the light to be seen. The man was lean, his skin the deep bronze of someone shaped by a lifetime beneath this sun. He wore no shirt, only a woven belt from which hung a knife with a black, glassy blade. Across his shoulders lay a short mantle, patterned in red and ochre. His hair was bound back with a strip of cloth, and in his left hand he carried a small bundle of maize ears, their husks tied neatly. The commander gave no order to draw weapons. Instead, he lifted one hand in an open gesture, palm outward, a sign as old as trade itself. The man did not mirror it. He stood still, his dark eyes passing over each face on the beach, lingering on the chest, being loaded into the boat. Then, as if satisfied, he set the maize gently on the sand and stepped back into the shade. Bernard approached the offering first. The ears were small by European standards, the kernels a pale gold and tightly packed. They were fresh, and when he peeled one back, the smell was sweet and grassy. Alain muttered something about traps, but Bernard shook his head. "This is food," he said, "and a message." The commander understood. This was an opening, an invitation, or at least a test. He ordered one of the sailors to fetch a small loaf of ship's bread and a pouch of salt from the boat. Bernard carried them to the edge of the shade and placed them where the maize had been, bowing his head slightly before stepping back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the man reappeared, moving silently to collect the bread and salt. He examined both, breaking the bread and sniffing it, tasting the salt with the tip of his tongue. His eyes flicked to the commander, and for the briefest moment, there was something like approval in them. What followed over the next hour was a careful dance of approach and retreat. The man returned with another figure, a woman carrying a clay jar that sweated cool moisture. She set it down on the sand, removed the stopper, and stepped back. Bernard knelt to examine it. The water inside was clear, with a faint scent of earth and flowers. He tasted it, smiled faintly, and drank. Communication began not with words, but with gesture. Bernard touched his chest, saying, "Bernard," slowly, and then pointed to the commander. "Jean?" The man in the shade did not speak at first, but after a pause he tapped his own chest. The sound was quick, syllables unfamiliar. "Tohbal." The woman followed. "Ixchel." The names passed back and forth, the crew repeating them awkwardly. Soon, other words came. Tohbal crouched and drew in the sand, a stalk of maize, a fish, the outline of a jaguar's head. Beside each, Bernard etched the Latin word frumentum, Piscis panthera. They repeated each other's terms slowly, smiling when the sounds came close to correct. Geoffroy, ever cautious, watched the tree line more than the lesson. He saw shapes there, other figures, half hidden, observing. This was no solitary meeting. The pair on the beach were emissaries, not wanderers. The commander, though silent for much of the exchange, eventually knelt and drew a cross in the sand. It was not the flared pate of the order, but the plain cruciform of Christendom. Tobal studied it, then without erasing it, drew a second shape beside it, a tree, its roots curling beneath, its branches spreading wide. He tapped the roots, then the branches, and spoke a string of words. Bernard could not follow all of them, but he understood enough. The tree joined earth and sky, just as the cross joined man and God. It was the first bridge between their beliefs, and it was made of symbols rather than doctrine. The commander inclined his head, an unspoken acknowledgement. Food followed. From the clay jar, Ixchel poured a thick drink into a small gourd cup, dark, almost black, with a faint sheen of oil. Bernard tasted it and recognized cacao, though unlike the sweetened drink of Europe, this was bitter, spiced with something sharp and floral. He passed the cup to the commander, who drank without grimace. In return, they broke the remaining ship's bread into small pieces and dipped it into the drink, mimicking the local custom. As the sun dipped toward the ridge, the meeting wound down. Tobal pointed to the maze, then to the forest, and then toward the ridge where the smoke had risen days before. Bernard guessed the meaning: their food, their people, their home. The commander made a decision. He touched his own chest, then pointed to the ship in the lagoon, and then to the shore between them. Tomorrow they would meet again. Tohobal gave a single nod, then stepped back into the shade, Ixchel behind him. The forest swallowed them without sound. That night the crew spoke in low voices over their rations. Some saw the exchange as a promise of safety, others as the first step into deeper entanglement. Bernard noted each word he had learned, sketching symbols in the margins of the ship's log. The commander stood apart, looking toward the dark line of the forest, wondering if the cross and the tree would grow together or strangle one another in the years to come. Above the tree line, the first stars were appearing, some familiar, others strange. Bernard, studying them, thought of the turtle shell map and the way its constellations mingled old and new. Tonight, it felt as though the land itself was doing the same, blending corn words with Latin prayers, grafting one root to another. And somewhere beyond the sand, unseen eyes had watched it all, deciding whether tomorrow's meeting would be one of welcome or of warning. The next meeting took place under a sky washed pale by morning heat. The sand was already warm, and the air hummed with the sound of unseen cicadas. The commander led a smaller party this time, Bernard as interpreter, Geoffroy for security, Alain to carry gifts, and 2 others to bear water skins. They landed in the same sheltered curve of the beach where the maze had been left the day before. Tohbal and Ixchel were waiting. This time they were not alone. 3 other men stood with them, all lean, bare-chested, their hair bound back in the same fashion. Each carried a weapon, a long, straight shaft, tipped with a blade of black stone. The blades caught the sun like liquid, throwing back quick flashes of light. Obsidian. The newcomers held the weapons loosely, neither threatening nor hiding them. Bernard read the posture for what it was. An introduction, much like the maze had been. This was how they hunted, fought, and protected their own. The commander signaled Alain forward. From the leather bundle he carried, Alain produced 3 iron knives, simple in form but well forged. The blades gleamed silver in the morning sun, their edges keen. He placed them on the sand between the groups, stepping back slowly. Tobal eyed the knives, then picked one up, testing its weight. He ran a thumb along the flat of the blade, then rapped it gently against his obsidian weapon. The dull clink was followed by a thin smile. He passed the knife to the man beside him, who examined it with equal care. Bernard crouched in the sand and began drawing. First he etched the outline of an obsidian blade, then an iron one. He tapped the stone blade and said, "Hard," then tapped the iron blade and said, "Strong," gesturing with both hands, as if resisting a break. Tobal watched, then knelt and drew a jaguar's head beside the obsidian, a boar beside the iron. Bernard understood. Stone, for killing the swift hunter, iron, for felling the stubborn prey. It was a strange form of negotiation, conducted entirely in images and mimed comparisons. Geoffroy remained alert, his eyes moving between the armed men and the shadows just inside the tree line. He could feel the presence of others, silent watchers who kept themselves hidden, but whose gaze was palpable. Tobal handed the iron knife to Ixchel, who examined it in turn. She mimed cutting through thick fibers, then nodded, speaking a string of words Bernard could not yet parse. Her tone, however, was approving. The commander stepped forward, drawing from his belt a dagger whose hilt was wrapped in worn leather. He held it flat across his palms, offering it for inspection. Tobal took it with both hands, weighing it carefully. He pressed the point into the sand, testing its sharpness against the earth's resistance, then handed it back with a slight bow. In return, he offered the commander his own weapon, a spear tipped with a wide obsidian blade set into a carved wooden shaft. The haft was painted with curling designs in red and black, and the obsidian edge was so fine it seemed almost to disappear when turned sideways. The commander felt its weight, lighter than he expected, perfectly balanced. He returned it with a nod that carried the same weight as any verbal thanks. When the formal exchange was done, the two groups sat on the sand in a loose semicircle. Tobal produced strips of dried meat wrapped in leaves, passing them around. The flavor was smoky, with a faint tang of something citrus-like. Bernard offered hard cheese from the ship's stores in return. As they ate, Bernard sketched more words in the sand, pairing them with gestures: aqua for water, ignis for fire, amicus for friend. Tobal and Ixchel responded with their own terms, repeating each in a rhythm that felt like the beginning of a shared language. The others listened closely, their expression sharpening with interest whenever a sound was mastered. The conversation, such as it was, eventually turned toward the ridge. Tobal drew its shape in the sand, placing small dots along its base and a larger one at its crest. He gestured inland, then back to the ship, then to the dots again. Bernard guessed the meaning. There were settlements there, perhaps more than one. The larger mark might be a central place, a gathering point. Geoffroy shifted uneasy. Settlements meant numbers, and numbers meant a balance of power the Sainte Marie could not match. But the commander's mind was already working along different lines. Settlements meant resources, knowledge of the land, and, if trust could be nurtured, protection against the dangers of the jungle. As the sun climbed, the meeting began to dissolve. Tobal rose first, planting his spear in the sand as he stood. He pointed toward the ship, then to the ridge, then made a slow, sweeping motion with his hand. Bernard thought it might be an invitation, though whether to visit or to watch from a distance was unclear. Before departing, Ixchel placed one of the maize ears into Bernard's hands. She spoke softly, the words too quick to follow, then tapped the ground between them and gestured to the ridge. Bernard could only nod, feeling the weight of the gift in a way that had little to do with its size. They parted without ceremony. The armed men melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared, Tobal and Ixchel following. The green wall closed behind them, leaving the beach once more an empty ribbon between sea and trees. Back aboard the Sainte Marie, the iron knives were missed from their bundle, but no one complained. In their place were the obsidian blades Tobal had left. A fair trade, the commander decided, and a sign that both sides recognized the value of the other's craft. Bernard sat near the rail, turning one of the black blades in his hand. Obsidian could cut flesh more cleanly than steel, sharper even than the finest sword, though it chipped easily against hard surfaces. In this place, with its dense forest and swift predators, each material had its own advantage. The commander watched the ridge as the afternoon shadows lengthened. He knew they stood at a crossroads. They could keep their distance, relying on the lagoon and the cenote, or they could risk deeper contact. The obsidian and iron in the sand this morning had been tools. Tomorrow, they might be symbols. That night, as the lantern swayed gently above the deck, Geoffroy cleaned and oiled his sword. Bernard sketched the obsidian spear in the margins of the logbook, noting the balance and shape. Alain, who had said little during the day, admitted in a whisper that he had seen a glint of eyes in the tree line. Not a jaguar this time, but human, watching from high among the branches. It was a reminder. In this land, nothing watched alone. The third meeting did not take place on the beach. Instead, Tohubal met them halfway, standing in the shallows near the mouth of the channel, his spear held upright like a staff. Behind him, 2 canoes floated low in the water, each paddled by a pair of men. The canoes were narrow but steady, their hulls carved from single tree trunks and blackened smooth with pitch. The commander read the unspoken invitation. He gave a brief nod, and soon the Sainte Marie's small boat was gliding alongside the canoes. Bernard sat in the bow, his eyes scanning the shoreline they had not yet approached. Geoffroy kept his sword within easy reach, though he let his gaze drift outward, as if simply admiring the lagoon. The canoes turned toward the channel and slipped into the cool shade of the mangroves. The air thickened with the scent of wet earth and blossoms. Birds with plumage as bright as spilled paint darted between branches, their cries sharp in the stillness. The water deepened, shifting from jade to a darker green, and the roots of the trees twisted downward into it like the legs of great spiders. After some minutes, the trees parted to reveal a bank of pale sand, and beyond it, a clearing dominated by a massive ceiba tree. Its trunk was so wide that 6 men linking arms could not have encircled it. The roots rose from the earth like ramparts, curling into hollows large enough for a man to sit in. The branches spread in a vast canopy that caught the sunlight in a net of gold and shadow. Beneath it, people waited. Women in woven skirts, children with bright beads at their necks, elders whose hair was silver against their sun-dark skin. Fires smoldered in shallow pits, and the air was rich with the smell of roasting fish and maize. The scene was not one of warriors braced for confrontation, but of hosts preparing a meal. The commander stepped from the boat onto the sand, moving slowly and deliberately. Tobal gestured for them to approach the ceiba's shade. Bernard, interpreting with the handful of shared words they had learned, explained that this was a gathering place, part meeting hall, part altar, part memory. The tree's roots, Tobal said, reached down into the underworld, while its branches touched the realm of the sky. It was the axis between all things. They were seated on woven mats arranged in a circle. A clay jug of water was passed first, followed by bowls of tamales wrapped in leaves. The tamales were soft and fragrant, filled with mashed maize and shreds of spiced meat. Bernard watched as the commander took his first bite, noting the approving nod from one of the elders. Sharing food was more than courtesy here. It was the cementing of intent. After the tamales came roasted fish, the flesh flaking apart under the touch of fingers, seasoned with a blend of herbs both sharp and sweet. Small bowls of cacao drink followed, richer than the version they had tasted on the beach, whipped to a froth with a carved wooden whisk. The bitterness was softened with honey, and the warmth of it settled deep in the chest. Conversation moved in small steps, each side adding to the growing vocabulary between them. Bernard learned the words for sun, river, home. The locals learned ship, sea, friend. Laughter rose more than once when a sound was mangled or a meaning reversed, and the Seba's shade seemed to hold the sound gently, like a shell holding the memory of the sea. At one point, an elder woman rose and approached the commander. In her hands, she carried a necklace strung with alternating beads of jade and bone. She placed it over his head without speaking, then stepped back. Bernard caught only fragments of her words, but the meaning was clear enough. A mark of welcome, perhaps of protection. In return, the commander drew from his belt a small silver cross, plain but finely worked. He held it up for the circle to see before placing it in the elder's hands. She turned it over, studying the light as it slid across the metal, and then tucked it into the folds of her mantle. Not all the exchange was ceremonial. Children approached Geoffroy with wide-eyed curiosity, touching the hilt of his sword and the links of his mail. He let them, though his eyes never left the tree line where shadows gathered. Alan showed them a small brass whistle, blowing a clear note that made them clap their hands and demand more. Under the Sheba, the air was cooler, and the minutes drifted into hours. The commander felt a strange calm settle over him. Not the tense stillness of the lagoon at night, but something rooted and steady. Yet he knew that roots could entangle as easily as they anchored. As the sun began its slide toward the horizon, Tobal spoke at length to Bernard, gesturing often toward the ridge. The words came faster than Bernard could follow, but he understood enough to relay the essence. There would be a gathering soon. A larger one, where those from farther inland would come. If the ship's people wished, they could be present. It was an opportunity and a test. The commander inclined his head, agreeing without yet knowing how they would approach it. When the time came to leave, the Seba's shade released them reluctantly, the warmth of the fire and the food still lingering in their clothes and skin. As they stepped into the canoes, Bernard looked back at the massive trunk and thought of the symbol Tobal had drawn in the sand days before, the tree beside the cross. Perhaps, he thought, under the right sky, the two could stand together. But he also knew that trees grew slowly, and some roots did not mingle without breaking stone. The canoes slid back through the channel, the mangroves closing around them once more. By the time they reached the Sainte Marie, the first stars were appearing, strange and familiar constellations woven into the same dark cloth. The commander stood at the rail long after the others had gone below, listening to the faint echo of voices beneath the Seba, wondering which of those stars looked down on both their worlds. The village's central plaza had been transformed overnight. Torches burned in a wide ring, their light licking the edges of a massive stone court that seemed too large for any simple game. Two parallel walls flanked the rectangular field, each rising higher than a man's reach. At their midpoints, carved stone rings jutted from the masonry, impossibly high, angled in such a way that any ball passing through would have to take a perfect arc. The air carried the mixed scents of roasted maize and fresh-cut copal resin, smoke curling upward into the open night. The Templar commander stood with Bernard at the edge of the crowd, trying to take in the scene. It was not a market day, nor a feast, yet the villagers had gathered in a mass. Painted faces peered from beneath feathered headdresses, and drums beat a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. In the open field, two teams of men, bare-chested, clad only in padded leather skirts and belts, stood in tense lines, the muscles of their arms and torsos shining with oil. Their expressions were focused, their eyes fixed on a black, heavy-looking ball resting on the center line. Bernard leaned close and murmured, "It is heavier than it looks. I have seen such balls in the markets of the East, made of pure rubber, 3 to 4 kilos perhaps. If it strikes the head—" He left the sentence unfinished. A shout rose from the crowd, and the game began. The ball was hurled into play not by hand or foot, but by the sharp pivot of a hip, the player twisting his body to send it arcing high into the air. It struck the ground with a dull, resonant thud. Another player caught it against his upper thigh, redirecting it without touching it with hands or feet. The rules became clear through observation. No grasping, no kicking, only the use of hips, shoulders, and forearms. The constraints made every pass and deflection a feat of skill, every collision a brutal contest. The commander noticed the patterns: short passes among teammates, sudden lunges toward the high stone rings. Once, a player leapt and twisted midair, striking the ball with his shoulder to send it upward toward the ring. It missed by a hand's breadth, tumbling back down into the chaos of the court. The crowd groaned as one, then roared as the other team seized possession. In the torchlight, the stone rings revealed their carvings, intricate patterns spiraling inward to a central motif, a double-armed cross, the lines subtly mirroring the twin crosses engraved on the copper disc they carried. The commander felt the hair on his neck rise. It could be coincidence, or another fragment of the same hidden pattern they had followed since the jungle. Off the field, women in long woven dresses carried trays of roasted corn and small packets of salt wrapped in leaves. They passed low braziers of copal, wafting the sweet resin smoke across the court, a scent older than the game itself. Children darted between the spectators, trading these for carved beads and dyed feathers. Bernard accepted a pouch of salt from an elderly vendor and whispered, "Corn and salt, as old as trade itself. But why here, in the middle of this?" The first score came suddenly. A player bent low, catching the ball against his hip, then vaulting into the air to strike it perfectly through the stone ring. The crowd erupted, drums pounding in double time. The scoring team fell into a chant, their captain lifting both arms toward the moon. The commander noted something else. The losing team's captain knelt, placing both hands flat on the stone floor, as two elders approached with bowls of incense. They circled him, speaking in low tones, then marked his shoulders with ash. There was no execution, no violent punishment, but the ritual carried weight. Bernard whispered the question already forming in the commander's mind. Is this penance or offering? A quirky detail surfaced in the commander's thoughts: the impossibly high rings. From their vantage, it seemed unlikely the ball would pass through often enough for scoring to decide the game. Perhaps the real purpose was not the victory itself, but the display, the arc of the ball mimicking the path of celestial bodies, the ring a stylized sun or moon. He wondered if the court's orientation matched the stars. The debated question pressed harder. Were they watching sport or ceremony? If it was ritual, then the Templars' arrival on this night was no accident. The commander thought of the watchers in the jungle, the jaguar's silent gaze, and the basin of still water that had reflected the constellations. Here, too, the stars hung heavy above, as if drawn to the court's invisible lines. As the match wore on, the drumming slowed, and the torches burned low. The final possession came to the team marked with the double cross on their sashes. A single flawless strike sent the ball cleanly through the ring, and the crowd's roar carried into the night. The victors gathered at the center, lifting their captain on their shoulders. The commander noticed one of them turn his head toward the foreign visitors, his eyes locking on the commander's own. For an instant, the noise faded, and it felt as though the game had been played for them alone. The players dispersed, the villagers drifting toward the food stalls and fires. Bernard remained silent, the small pouch of salt still in his hand. The commander glanced once more at the stone rings, the twin crosses carved deep into their faces, then at the moon above them. The plaza emptied until only the Templars and a few elders remained. One of the elders stepped forward, gesturing for them to follow. The commander glanced at Bernard, then stepped into the shadowed passage leading out of the plaza. He felt the pull again, not of the sea this time, but of stone, of walls older than the court, older perhaps than the village itself. Somewhere beyond this passage lay the next piece of the pattern, and if the rings and the crosses were any indication, it would lead them deeper still, into a place where games ended and truths began. The drum's last echoes faded behind them as they entered the narrow corridor, the smell of incense and stone dust guiding them toward a chamber whose secrets had waited for centuries. The corridor narrowed until it forced them to walk single file. The torch Bernard carried hissed faintly, the flame bending as if pulled toward some unseen current ahead. The stone underfoot was smooth from centuries of passage, but here and there, faint grooves cut across it, patterns too deliberate to be mistakes, too worn to be fresh. The commander bent low once, brushing away a layer of dust to reveal a carving. Two intersecting crosses, one etched over the other, the lines notched as if to catch and hold light. The elder who guided them moved without hesitation, his bare feet silent on the stone. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of limestone and something more ancient, dry earth perhaps, or the residue of smoke from rituals long past. They emerged into a cavernous chamber open to the night sky. Above, the moon hung directly overhead, spilling its light down onto a stepped pyramid that rose at the far end. Its stone blocks gleamed pale silver. The faces of each step cut at angles that seemed to catch the moonlight and direct it upward. The structure was not massive like the great temples of Chichen Itza, but its symmetry and proportion spoke of a knowledge just as refined. Bernard's voice was a whisper. It aligns with zenith passages and eclipse sightlines. This is deliberate. From the summit, the court below revealed its geometry. Rings, walls, and stair edges all set to catch the sky's slow mathematics. The base of the pyramid was surrounded by stelae, each carved with glyphs and reliefs. One depicted a ship with a high prow unlike any canoe the commander had seen in these lands. Another showed figures in robes, their hands resting on the hilts of long swords. On more than one, the twin crosses appeared, not as decoration, but as the central element, rays spilling from their intersection like the sun itself. The elder gestured for them to ascend. The steps were steep, narrow, and forced a slow, careful climb. At the midpoint, the commander paused, his hand brushing over a small inlaid stone, jaded, impossibly green, set flush into the limestone. He remembered the pouches of salt from the plaza, the way the villagers had traded it with reverence. Salt and stone, sun and cross, motifs repeating like a code. Near the summit, a low doorway led into a chamber at the pyramid's heart. The walls were covered in murals, bold pigments that had somehow resisted time's erasure. One panel showed a storm-tossed fleet, ships with square sails battling towering waves. Another depicted survivors crawling ashore on a land dominated by jungle and mountains. In the final panel, robed figures stood before a stepped pyramid, much like the one they now stood within, presenting a disc to a priest wearing a jaguar headdress. Bernard touched the image of the disc. It's the same size, the same markings. They were here. His voice trembled with the weight of the idea. Templars? In this place? Centuries before we thought possible. A low stone altar occupied the chamber's center. Upon it lay a single object, a weathered tablet, its surface covered in both Maya glyphs and what appeared to be Latin script. The commander traced the grooves with his fingers. The Latin was faded, but fragments could be read: Mare transire, fides servare. To cross the sea, to keep the faith. The elder began to speak in his own tongue, his voice low and melodic. Bernard translated in a murmur. He says the stone tells of strangers from the east who came not to conquer, but to hide. They brought with them knowledge of the stars, the making of ships, and a map to a place of great light. They swore an oath to guard it until the cycle of the 2 moons returned. The commander's mind raced. The cycle could mean an astronomical alignment, perhaps the very one they stood under now. If the Templars had indeed crossed the Atlantic, carrying maps, knowledge, perhaps even relics, then this pyramid was not just a monument. It was a message, a waypoint on a hidden trail. A quirky detail drew his eye. On one mural, a figure in robes wore not the expected sandals, but pointed shoes, the tips curling upward. Such footwear was known from medieval Europe, never from these lands. It was an odd inclusion unless the artist had seen it firsthand. But questions rose with equal force. If the strangers had integrated enough to have their symbols carved into the sacred architecture, what bargain had been struck with the local rulers? And why had they not returned to Europe or sent word? Had they chosen exile, or had they been prevented from leaving? The elder's voice shifted in tone, becoming more formal, almost ceremonial. He led them out onto the pyramid summit. From here, the jungle stretched to the horizon, broken only by the glint of water in the distance. The stars shone with startling clarity. Bernard pointed toward the east. There, see? The Pleiades rising just over the horizon. The alignment matches the mural exactly. The commander looked down. The plaza below lay empty now, but from this height he could see that the stone court was not aligned with the village, but with the pyramid itself. The rings, the carvings, the game. They were all part of a single geometric pattern, visible only from above. The elder placed a hand on the commander's shoulder, his gaze steady. Bernard translated softly. He says the path is not yet complete. There is one more place, beyond the river and the falls, where the final mark waits, but it is guarded, not by men. The torches below had burned down to embers. A cold wind swept across the pyramid's peak, carrying the scent of rain. The commander thought of the storm in the mural, the survivors, the oath. If this was true, if even part of it was true, then the maps they carried were more than treasure. They were keys to a history the world had never written. As they descended the pyramid, the first drops of rain struck the stone, each one ringing softly like a distant bell. The jungle ahead waited, its shadows deep, its guardians unseen. The rain thickened as they left the pyramid behind, soaking the torches until they sputtered and hissed. The elder led them along a narrow path that wound through the jungle, roots rising like serpents across their way. The air grew heavier with the scent of wet earth and blooming orchids, but beneath it lurked another smell, stagnant water, tinged with the faint musk of something alive, watching. The ground sloped downward until the forest opened to a wide river, its surface mottled with floating leaves and blossoms. Even in the dim light, the water had an odd sheen, shifting from green to brown with the current's mood. On the far bank, the tree line rose again, shrouded in mist. Bernard squatted at the edge, dipping a hand in briefly before pulling it back. Warm and slow-moving. That means... He didn't finish the thought. They all knew slow water meant hiding places. For predators. The elder pointed downstream where the river narrowed, churning white between dark, jagged rocks. Above that churn rose a thunderous roar, the falls he had spoken of at the pyramid. Between here and there, the current was deceptively calm, but the commander's eyes caught the occasional ripple that moved against the flow. It was then they saw them. Two ridges breaking the surface, sliding toward the shore without a sound. Eyes, unblinking. The elder called them Itzam's teeth, giant crocodiles said to guard the sacred crossing. To step into the river without the proper rites was to be claimed by the water god. From his pouch, the elder drew a small bundle wrapped in palm fiber. He unwrapped it to reveal maize kernels and coarse salt, the same elements from the plaza. Kneeling at the bank, he cast them in a slow arc across the surface, chanting words that rose and fell with the rhythm of the water. The first crocodile halted, drifting with the current. The second rolled once, showing the pale armor of its belly before disappearing below. Bernard whispered, "It's either working, or they're just deciding which one of us is tastiest." The crossing was not a simple ford. The elder led them upriver to where a series of fallen ceiba trees had been lashed together, forming a floating bridge. The commander stepped onto it cautiously. The wood was slick, the gaps wide enough to glimpse the slow, patient shapes gliding below. Halfway across, the rain slackened, and a shaft of pale light broke through the clouds, striking the water. For a moment, the ripples formed a pattern, a rough circle bisected by a cross. Bernard saw it too, his eyes widening. "Again," he said softly, "the twin crosses even here." They reached the far bank without incident, though the commander could not shake the sense of being tracked. On the shore, the elder drew a line in the sand with a branch, then placed a small obsidian shard in its center. Bernard explained, a warding mark, to keep what follows from crossing. Beyond the river, the jungle rose sharply toward the sound of the falls. The path was narrow, winding between boulders slick with moss. Strange orchids hung from branches overhead, their petals shaped like open mouths. More than once, they passed stone markers half swallowed by roots, carvings of serpents, jaguars, and faces with eyes closed in eternal vigil. One marker, set beside a trickling stream, bore an image that stopped them cold, a ship, unmistakably European in design, sailing toward a stepped pyramid. Below it, in fine incisions, was a line of glyphs intertwined with unfamiliar script, possibly Old French or Latin. The commander traced the lettering, the damp moss cold against his fingers. It was another link, another impossible thread tying their own journey to those who came before. The roar of the falls grew until it drowned all speech. When they reached the base, mist billowed up in thick clouds, coating their skin in cool droplets. The water plunged from a height, splitting into multiple streams that crashed against hidden rocks below. The elder pointed to a shadowed cleft behind the main curtain of water. They waited for a lull in the wind before edging along the slick path that hugged the rock wall. The commander gripped the stone, each step a careful test. The spray blinded them, each breath tasting of minerals and cold. Passing behind the veil of water, the sound softened to a muffled roar, revealing a hidden chamber carved into the cliff itself. The chamber was small but dry, its walls etched with spirals and star maps. At its center lay a flat stone slab, its surface worn smooth. In its middle was a shallow depression filled with rainwater reflecting the torchlight. Bernard crouched to examine it. "This is an alignment basin," he said. "When the Pleiades pass directly overhead, the reflection matches the star pattern in the carvings." In one corner of the chamber, tucked into a niche, was a wooden chest, its surface blackened by age, but intact. The commander ran a hand over the lid, feeling the raised design of the twin crosses. With effort, they forced it open. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilskin, lay a bundle of rolled vellum and a small, tarnished medallion, its design unmistakable to any who knew Templar lore. The medallion was heavy in the commander's palm, its edges worn smooth, the cross at its center flanked by 2 crescent moons. Bernard's voice was low. "This is it, the cycle of the 2 moons the elder spoke of." Quirky detail. Among the vellum sheets was a drawing of a creature that looked half serpent, half fish, annotated in both glyphs and Latin. Some believed such drawings were symbolic, but the elder insisted it was a guardian spirit of the river, a being as real as the crocodiles. Debated question: were these maps and symbols proof of a deliberate Templar voyage to the New World, or the fantasy of shipwrecked survivors weaving their own legend into Maya history? The evidence lay in their hands, but interpretation would depend on the one who told the story. Outside, the roar of the falls seemed louder, as if the jungle itself had heard the chest open. Somewhere beyond the mist, a shadow moved. Not crocodile, not man. The mist clung to their clothes as they stepped back into the roar of the waterfall, clutching the chest and its secrets. The commander kept glancing over his shoulder toward the chamber they had just left, as if expecting the stone walls to close behind them. Bernard tightened his grip on the bundle of vellum. The elder's eyes were fixed on the curtain of water, his lips moving in silent prayer. It was then they saw it. Beyond the veil of spray, Half shrouded in drifting mist, a shape moved with slow deliberation. At first it seemed like nothing more than a shifting shadow against the rock face. But then came the low, resonant sound, something between a growl and a hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The commander's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though the blade's weight felt pitifully inadequate against something so alien. Bernard's breath came faster. "It's not crocodile," he murmured, "and it's not a man." The elder motioned for them to follow him along the narrow ledge. They edged sideways, backs scraping against wet stone, until they emerged into a sheltered alcove downstream from the falls. Here, the water frothed into a broad pool before spilling into the jungle river below. From this angle, they could see the far side of the plunge basin, and the figure that stood there. It was tall, hunched, and draped in something that clung to its body like woven reeds. Around its neck hung a necklace of shells and what looked disturbingly like teeth, large, curved, too white to be stone. Its face was obscured by a mask shaped like a serpent's head, fangs bared. The elder whispered a name, Apuku. Bernard translated with a shiver, the keeper of thresholds. In Maya lore, it was said to guard places where the living could cross into the realm of the dead, or into realms beyond their own world. The figure did not approach. Instead, it raised one arm and pointed, not at them, but at the falls themselves. Then it turned and melted into the mist, gone without a sound. The commander's knuckles whitened around the sword hilt. "Message or warning?" he asked. The elder only shook his head. They decided not to linger. The path ahead climbed steeply along the cliffside, winding through curtains of vines and narrow switchbacks carved into the rock. From above, the pool and the falls shrank into a miniature world of silver and green. The roar faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the thrum of the jungle. Monkeys calling in the canopy, insects buzzing in invisible clouds. It was on this ascent that Bernard noticed something carved into the rock face at shoulder height. A pair of interlocking circles, each containing a cross. This was no natural fissure. The edges were clean, deliberate, weathered by centuries but still distinct. The twin crosses again, here on a path few would dare to tread. Whoever marked this, Bernard said, knew this was more than just a waterfall. They were mapping a journey. The commander ran a thumb over the carving, or marking a claim. By midday, the trail leveled onto a plateau, a hidden shelf in the mountainside, sheltered from the wind and invisible from below. Here, the ruins of low stone walls and collapsed huts sprawled across the clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each bearing deep grooves and holes. Bernard knelt to examine one. "These are mooring stones. For ship's rigging, maybe. But here, in the mountains?" The elder explained that this plateau was once connected to the river by a series of canals and wooden ramps, now long gone. Goods, and perhaps entire canoes, were hauled up here to avoid the treacherous falls. The commander imagined the impossible sight, vessels suspended above the roaring chasm, inching upward on ropes and pulleys, watched by figures in serpent masks. Inside one of the ruined huts, they found a scatter of broken pottery painted with spirals and stars, alongside rusted metal fragments, a buckle here, a nail there, foreign to Maya craftsmanship. Bernard turned one fragment over and over in his hands. "Templar iron," he said quietly. "I'd swear it." They camped there for the night, the plateau offering a rare sense of defensible ground. As dusk fell, the air turned cooler, scented with crushed herbs from the undergrowth. They lit a small fire, careful to keep it shielded from view. Above them, the sky cleared, revealing the first stars. The elder pointed out constellations in both Maya and European traditions, weaving them together in a seamless tapestry of stories. Bernard traced the patterns with his eyes, pausing at one cluster low on the horizon. "That's where the Pleiades should be," he murmured. "And if the alignment basin in the falls chamber is right, then—" He didn't finish. From the darkness beyond the ring of firelight came the sound again, the deep, resonant hum. It was closer now, vibrating through the stones under their feet. The commander rose, scanning the shadows between the huts. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Quirky detail. Bernard noticed that the firelight cast shadows on the standing stones in such a way that, from one angle, they resembled the prow of a ship, complete with sails, pointing toward the north. Debated question. Was the Keeper of Thresholds a living guardian, a costumed member of a hidden order, or something older, something that lingered in places where worlds touched? As the fire burned low, a faint glow appeared on the far side of the clearing, blue-white, pulsing like a heartbeat. It came from beyond the circle of standing stones, where the path narrowed into the blackness of the upper jungle. The mist clung to their clothes as they stepped back into the roar of the waterfall, clutching the chest and its secrets. The commander kept glancing over his shoulder toward the chamber they had just left, as if expecting the stone walls to close behind them. Bernard tightened his grip on the bundle of vellum. The elder's eyes were fixed on the curtain of water, his lips moving in silent prayer. It was then they saw it. Beyond the veil of spray, half shrouded in drifting mist, a shape moved with slow deliberation. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shifting shadow against the rock face. But then came the low, resonant sound, something between a growl and a hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The commander's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though the blade's weight felt pitifully inadequate against something so alien. Bernard's breath came faster. "It's not crocodile," he murmured, "and it's not a man." The elder motioned for them to follow him along the narrow ledge. They edged sideways, backs scraping against wet stone, until they emerged into a sheltered alcove downstream from the falls. Here, the water frothed into a broad pool before spilling into the jungle river below. From this angle, they could see the far side of the plunge basin and the figure that stood there. It was tall, hunched, and draped in something that clung to its body like woven reeds. Around its neck hung a necklace of shells and what looked disturbingly like teeth, large, curved, too white to be stone. Its face was obscured by a mask shaped like a serpent's head, fangs bared. The elder whispered a name, Apuku. Bernard translated with a shiver. The Keeper of Thresholds. In Maya lore, it was said to guard places where the living could cross into the realm of the dead, or into realms beyond their own world. The figure did not approach. Instead, it raised one arm and pointed, not at them, but at the falls themselves. Then it turned and melted into the mist, gone without a sound. The commander's knuckles whitened around the sword hilt. "Message or warning?" he asked. The elder only shook his head. They decided not to linger. The path ahead climbed steeply along the cliffside, winding through curtains of vines and narrow switchbacks carved into the rock. From above, the pool and the falls shrank into a miniature world of silver and green. The roar faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the thrum of the jungle, monkeys calling in the canopy, insects buzzing in invisible clouds. It was on this ascent that Bernard noticed something carved into the rock face at shoulder height, a pair of interlocking circles, each containing a cross. This was no natural fissure. The edges were clean, deliberate, weathered by centuries, but still distinct. The twin crosses again, here on a path few would dare to tread. Whoever marked this, Bernard said, knew this was more than just a waterfall. They were mapping a journey. The commander ran a thumb over the carving, or marking a claim. By midday, the trail leveled onto a plateau, a hidden shelf in the mountainside, sheltered from the wind and invisible from below. Here, the ruins of low stone walls and collapsed huts sprawled across the clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each bearing deep grooves and holes. Bernard knelt to examine one. These are mooring stones. For ship's rigging, maybe, but here, in the mountains? The elder explained that this plateau was once connected to the river by a series of canals and wooden ramps, now long gone. Goods, and perhaps entire canoes, were hauled up here to avoid the treacherous falls. The commander imagined the impossible sight: vessels suspended above the roaring chasm, inching upward on ropes and pulleys, watched by figures in serpent masks. Inside one of the ruined huts, they found a scatter of broken pottery painted with spirals and stars, alongside rusted metal fragments, a buckle here, a nail there, foreign to Maya craftsmanship. Bernard turned one fragment over and over in his hands. "Templar iron," he said quietly. "I'd swear it." They camped there for the night, the plateau offering a rare sense of defensible ground. As dusk fell, the air turned cooler, scented with crushed herbs from the undergrowth. They lit a small fire, careful to keep it shielded from view. Above them, the sky cleared, revealing the first stars. The elder pointed out constellations in both Maya and European traditions, weaving them together in a seamless tapestry of stories. Bernard traced the patterns with his eyes, pausing at one cluster low on the horizon. "That's where the Pleiades should be," he murmured, "and if the alignment basin in the falls chamber is right, then—" He didn't finish. From the darkness beyond the ring of firelight came the sound again, the deep, resonant hum. It was closer now, vibrating through the stones under their feet. The commander rose, scanning the shadows between the huts. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Quirky detail. Bernard noticed that the firelight cast shadows on the standing stones in such a way that from one angle they resembled the prow of a ship, complete with sails, pointing toward the north. Debated question. Was the Keeper of Thresholds a living guardian, a costumed member of a hidden order, or something older? Something that lingered in places where worlds touched. As the fire burned low, a faint glow appeared on the far side of the clearing, blue-white, pulsing like a heartbeat. It came from beyond the circle of standing stones, where the path narrowed into the blackness of the upper jungle. The glow pulsed again, slow, steady, almost alive. Each flare painted the trunks in shades of spectral blue, then retreated into darkness. The commander signaled for silence. Bernard adjusted the bundle of vellum under his arm, every instinct urging him to stay within the safety of the fire's circle. But curiosity, like the jungle itself, crept in and took root. They moved toward the standing stones. The elder followed at their side, his staff tapping against the earth in a rhythm almost in time with the glow's pulse. As they passed between two of the tallest monoliths, the night air thickened. The smell changed. Less damp earth, more a strange metallic tang that clung to the tongue. The path narrowed into a corridor of overgrown trees. Here, the canopy was so dense that no moonlight pierced it, making the glow their only guide. It came from somewhere ahead, where the ground sloped downward into a shallow basin. The sound reached them next, a deep, slow thud, like the beat of a drum, but too even, too mechanical for a hand to produce. When they reached the basin's edge, they saw it, a flat stone platform ringed with glyphs, and at its center a crystal orb the size of a man's head. It was the orb that glowed, the light seeping from within, brightening and dimming, as if in sync with some distant heart. The elder inhaled sharply, then began murmuring in a low chant. Maya priests, in night rites, burned copal and worked obsidian and rock crystal for divination, reading what the sky withheld. Bernard crouched near the edge, studying the glyphs. Many were familiar, representations of the sun, maize, jaguars, but others were foreign, angular, and sharp-edged. These aren't all Maya, he said, tracing one with a finger. Some of them match the inscriptions from the Templar reliquary back in Europe. But how? The commander's eyes scanned the perimeter. Orbs don't appear by accident, he said. This is a beacon. The question is, who is it calling? Quirky detail. At the base of one glyph was a carving of a sailing ship, not a Maya canoe, but a square-sailed round ship, its sails etched with twin crosses. It was small, almost an afterthought, as though hidden in plain sight. The elder broke his chant and spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper. It is said that the orb holds the light of a star that fell into the jungle long before men came. The ones who found it could walk between worlds. Bernard exchanged a glance with the commander. Worlds as in continents? The elder did not answer. A sudden rustle in the tree line drew their attention. Shadows shifted, and the keeper of thresholds stepped into the basin, mask gleaming faintly in the orb's glow. Its serpent eyes reflected the light, unblinking. It approached the platform, touched the orb once with an open palm, and the glow flared, bright enough to throw their own shadows high onto the surrounding trees. Then, without a word, the keeper turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving the orb pulsing faster now, as though stirred by the contact. Bernard felt the hair on his arms rise. It's responding. The commander approached the platform cautiously. He extended a hand toward the orb, hesitating just before touching it. The light seemed to bend toward him, like a flame, leaning into the wind. When his fingers brushed the surface, an image flashed through his mind. A coastline unlike any he knew, with towering stone pyramids and ships anchored just offshore. The scene was gone as quickly as it came, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. The elder's voice was grave. You have been shown a path, but every path has its price. They debated whether to take the orb, but the elder warned it could not be moved without ending the connection it maintained. If you break it from its cradle, he said, its light will fade, and the way will close. Debated question. Was the orb a relic from an ancient meteorite worshipped by the Maya, later altered by Templars who reached these shores? Or was it something older still, a true artifact of otherworldly origin. The commander decided they would mark the location carefully, copying the glyphs onto vellum. Bernard sketched the basin's shape, noting its orientation toward a particular gap in the tree line. Through that gap, the stars formed a narrow alignment, straight to the Pleiades. They left the basin before dawn, careful to cover their tracks. As they returned to the plateau, the jungle seemed quieter, almost reverent, as if aware they had touched something sacred. The orb's glow still lingered faintly in their eyes, an afterimage they could not blink away. Back at the camp, Bernard packed the sketches with the other relics they had collected. The keeper's mask, half remembered in the flicker of sleep, seemed to tilt toward a stone-paved path falling into the darker jungle, the road the elders would later call the Stone Road. The commander stood at the plateau's edge, watching the horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay the coast, and perhaps the next piece of the map. From the depths of the jungle came a single, resonant thud, the same rhythm as the orb's heartbeat, followed by the distant echo of drums. The drum beats carried through the pre-dawn mist, rolling in waves as tangible as the salt air itself. Each note seemed to come from somewhere just beyond sight, somewhere where the jungle broke into open space. The commander lifted his head, listening, not to the rhythm itself, but to the spaces between each strike. Bernard counted softly. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, repeats every 20 heartbeats. That's not random. The elder, who had accompanied them from the basin, nodded. A signal. They are calling to the coast. They followed the sound eastward, winding through tangled roots and low-hanging vines until the scent of brine grew stronger. The ground softened underfoot, turning sandy. Here the jungle began to thin, replaced by sparse palms swaying against a pale horizon. The first light of day revealed the line where deep green met deep blue. On a rise overlooking the beach, they stopped. Below, a village of stilted huts clung to the sand's edge, their thatched roofs damp with sea spray. The drums sat atop a platform of woven reeds and driftwood, played by 2 men whose painted faces gleamed in the morning light. Their bodies moved with practiced precision, each strike of the drum sending a message across the water. Quirky detail. Near the drums lay a large conch shell, fitted with a carved wooden mouthpiece, an improvised trumpet, painted in spirals of red and white. One of the drummers alternated between striking the drum and sounding the conch, its mournful note blending with the crash of waves. The villagers noticed the strangers almost immediately. A group of warriors approached, carrying spears tipped with obsidian and shields painted with stylized fish and jaguars. At their head was a man wearing a pectoral of hammered gold, shaped like the sun and studded with greenstone beads. The elder stepped forward, speaking in a language neither Bernard nor the commander understood. After a tense exchange, the gold-breasted leader signaled for the warriors to lower their weapons. He gestured toward the shoreline. As they descended to the beach, Bernard saw what had drawn the leader's attention. Half buried in the sand at the waterline was a fragment of wood, curved and ribbed like the hull of a ship. It was weathered to silver gray, but faint traces of red paint clung to the grain. Bernard knelt, brushing away the sand. His heart skipped. The fragment bore the remnants of an engraved cross, nearly identical to the ones on their own shields. "Templar," he murmured. The leader watched him closely. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he motioned for two men to bring something from one of the huts. They returned with a bundle wrapped in woven cloth. When it was opened, Bernard drew in a sharp breath. Inside was a brass astrolabe, its edges dulled by corrosion, but its markings unmistakably European. The commander turned it over in his hands. "Seawater damage," he said, "but it's been here for years, decades maybe." The elder translated the leader's explanation. A great storm had driven several floating houses to this shore long ago. Some were smashed upon the reefs, but others drifted further south, where their fate was unknown. Survivors, few in number, had come ashore here, offering strange coins and pieces of steel in exchange for food. Then, one morning, they were gone. Debated question: did those survivors perish in the jungle, or did they sail onward, perhaps reaching the very basin with the orb, or even further, to leave marks near the pyramids inland? The leader offered no theory, only a shrug. The commander studied the horizon. The reefs here were treacherous, jagged teeth just beneath the surface. If the rest of their fleet tried to land, they'd have been torn apart. One of the warriors approached Bernard, offering a small wooden carving. It depicted a ship, its sails adorned not with twin crosses, but with a jaguar's head. Bernard guessed it was a local reinterpretation of the stranger's vessels, a symbol transformed by memory. They spent the day among the villagers, trading bits of copper wire and iron nails for dried fish and sea salt. Bernard noted how often the drums sounded, sending their coded beats out over the water. He asked the elder what message they were sending. The answer was simple. They call to the spirits of the sea, so that the tides will be kind. But later, as the sun dipped toward the ocean, Bernard suspected there was more. Out at the edge of sight, beyond the reef, a dark shape broke the surface. A hull, maybe, or the shadow of a reef. But it vanished before he could be certain. That night they were invited to sit by the fire. The leader told a story of white-sailed strangers who had promised to return. His eyes fixed on Bernard as he spoke, as if measuring whether the promise was now fulfilled. Before dawn, the commander made a decision. They would follow the coastline south, toward where the leader said the survivors had gone. If the reefs allowed it, they might find more wreckage, or answers. Bernard packed the vellum maps, making careful note of the village's location and the tides. As they prepared to leave, the gold-breasted leader handed the commander a final gift. A strip of sailcloth, faded and fraying, but bearing the unmistakable red of a Templar cross. The drums sounded again as they pushed away from the beach, the same 3-beat, 2-beat pattern, fading into the crash of waves as they rounded the first headland. And ahead, the coastline curved into shadow. Morning broke, with a sky the color of hammered pewter, clouds hanging low and heavy as if weighed down by the secrets they carried. The sea was calmer than it had been in days, but its surface bore an oily stillness that made Bernard uneasy. Their canoe slid southward, hugging the coastline, the faint echo of the village drums still lingering in memory, like the last note of a hymn. The shoreline bent inward into a long crescent bay. From a distance, the sand appeared littered with driftwood, but as they drew closer, the truth revealed itself. Splintered beams, rotting ribs of ships, and masts jutting from the shallows like gravestones. Bernard stood, balancing carefully in the canoe, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The geometry of the remains was unmistakable, European hull design, clinker built, with remnants of iron nails where native craft used wooden pegs. A few planks still bore faded red pigment. The twin cross, ghost-like now, peeked through the salt-bleached grain. Quirky detail. A tangle of kelp had wrapped itself around one mast, and from its top fluttered not cloth, but the skeleton of a large seabird, its wings still half spread, as though frozen mid-flight. They beached the canoe near the largest wreck, where the hull was split open like a rib cage. Inside lay fragments of barrels, the rusted hoops barely clinging to warped staves. A few had spilled their contents long ago, glass beads, strangely luminous even under the gray light, scattered across the sand like spilled stars. The commander crouched beside a length of chain, lifting it with both hands. "Anchor cable," he muttered. "Too heavy for local craft." This was a warship. The elder, who had kept a silent watch, finally spoke. "The sea took them. The reef is not the only danger. There is a current here that pulls and will not let go." As they explored further along the bay, Bernard spotted something half buried in the sand, a metal disc, green with corrosion. He dug it free, revealing an ornate belt buckle bearing a lion rampant, not a symbol of the temple, but of a noble house from across the sea. The find deepened the mystery. If not all aboard were Templars, then perhaps other allies or mercenaries had sailed with them. Among the timbers they found a small chest, its iron fittings rusted through. Inside was nothing but blackened fragments of parchment, unreadable save for a single faint compass rose. Bernard's heart pounded. Even this fragment hinted at navigation records that could rewrite maps. Debated question: if some ships were wrecked here and survivors moved inland, did they take the most precious cargo, the orb, the astrolabe, and the maps, with them? Or were those treasures split among different survivors along the coast, destined never to be reunited? The commander noted scorch marks along one hull fragment. This wasn't just wrecked, it was burned. Either they set fire to prevent capture, or the locals did. The elder avoided meeting his eyes. Further south along the bay, they found an odd sight. A mast still standing upright in shallow water, its yardarm draped with woven reeds and seashells. The elder explained it was a shrine, maintained by generations of fishermen, who believed the masts were doorways to the sea spirits. Bernard ran his hand over the shells. Some were recent, still holding their pearlescent sheen, but others were fossilized, fused with coral growth. It was as if centuries of offerings had merged into a single memorial. They camped that night in the lee of the largest wreck, the timbers creaking faintly as the tide shifted. The wind carried scents of tar, salt, and something faintly metallic, the ghost of iron tools rusting into the earth. Bernard lay awake, staring up at the dark outline of the mast against the stars, imagining the fleet whole and proud, sails taut, crossing the endless blue. In the middle of the night, a change in the wind brought a new sound, the distant thump of drums. Not from the village they had left, but further south. The commander rose immediately. They're signaling again, but to whom? Bernard strained to listen. The rhythm was different. 4 beats, pause, 1 beat. It repeated, urgent. The elder's face was unreadable, but his voice was low. "It is a warning. The coast ahead is not safe." Morning came with a fine drizzle. They pushed off from the beach, the wreckage fading behind them as they rounded a rocky headland. Bernard kept looking back. the skeletal masts diminishing into the mist like mourners at the edge of a grave. As the shoreline unfolded ahead, they glimpsed movement on the cliffs, a flicker of red cloth in the wind, too high for any fisherman to reach. The commander's hand tightened on the tiller, steering them toward it, knowing that whatever lay beyond might be as perilous as the reefs they had just left behind. The canoe skimmed along the headland's edge, the sea below churning where waves collided with the cliff face. Spray leapt upward in cold bursts, stinging Bernard's cheeks. He could still see it, the flash of red, like a wound cut into the gray stone. The commander's jaw was set, eyes fixed on that defiant splash of color. They rounded a jagged spur of rock and found a small inlet hidden between towering cliffs. The water here was calmer, but deep, its color shifting from green to an inky black. High above, tethered to a wooden stake hammered into the cliffside, hung long banners of crimson cloth. The wind snapped them like whips, the frayed edges stained darker as though by old salt or something else. The elder, seated at the bow, did not look up. "This is a place of challenge," he said. "To climb is to enter a trial. Few return." The commander searched for a path upward. A narrow ledge zigzagged toward the banners, part natural rock, part roughly hewn steps. The markings on the steps were faint, weathered by centuries, but Bernard could make out spirals and cross shapes cut into the stone, motifs eerily close to the twin cross, but distorted, as though filtered through another culture's lens. Quirky detail. At the base of the first step, a stone carving depicted a jaguar wearing what looked like a conical European helmet, its feline eyes narrowed in a knowing glare. They secured the canoe and began the ascent. The climb was slow, the rock slick with moss, the air heavy with the smell of guano from seabirds nesting in the crevices. As they neared the midpoint, Bernard noticed niches cut into the cliff, each holding small offerings: shell necklaces, clay figurines, dried ears of corn. The corn kernels were painted red, the same hue as the banners. Halfway up, a shadow moved in a side crevice. From it emerged a man draped in feathers and crimson cloth, his face painted in black lines that ran from his eyes to his jaw. He said nothing, only gestured for them to follow. The commander hesitated, but the elder stepped forward. "If we are summoned, we must go." The narrow passage opened into a ledge where the red banners were anchored. From here, the sea spread endlessly, the horizon a smudged line between gray sky and green water. On the rock wall, behind the fluttering cloth, was a vast mural. It showed ships with high prows and square sails, some burning, others beached. Around them stood figures in both European armor and native dress, their hands joined in a circle. Above, stylized stars formed a constellation Bernard had only seen once before, in the margin of the scorched parchment from the graveyard of masts. Debated question: was this mural a record of the Templars' arrival, or a myth shaped by centuries of retelling? And if it was true, why did it show alliance rather than conquest? The feathered man pointed to a hollow in the cliff wall. Inside, dim light revealed objects resting on a stone slab: a rusted dagger with a cross-shaped hilt, a clay jar painted with spirals, and a shard of bronze inscribed with characters that were neither Latin nor Mayan. Bernard's hand trembled as he reached toward the shard, but the man stepped between them. "Not yet," the elder translated softly. "These are for those who pass the trial." The trial began without ceremony. The man led them further along the cliff, where the path narrowed to a single step-wide ledge above the crashing surf. Below, jagged rocks waited like teeth. At intervals, they had to leap across gaps where the cliff had crumbled, relying on handholds carved into the stone. The wind tugged at them, and the roar of the sea filled their ears. Bernard felt the air thicken with a strange exhilaration. This was as much a test of will as of balance. At last, the path widened into a natural archway leading to a plateau. Here the banners formed a circle, their crimson fabric enclosing a space marked with symbols burned into the ground. At the center lay a stone disc, carved with both the twin cross and the jaguar motif. The feathered man motioned for Bernard to step forward. When Bernard did, the man scattered a handful of red corn kernels onto the disc. They rolled into the grooves of the carvings, catching in the cross's arms. The man then spoke in a low chant, the words rising and falling like waves. Bernard couldn't understand, but he felt their weight, an invocation, perhaps, or a warning. The commander whispered, "Look around the edge." Bernard did. Each banner pole bore notches, 7 on one, 13 on another, and so on. Together they formed a sequence. Bernard recognized it. The same numbers inscribed on the broken astrolabe fragment they had recovered earlier in the journey. Quirky connection. The numbers corresponded to lunar months, suggesting the banners weren't just markers, but part of an astronomical calendar. Could this cliff have served as both ritual ground and navigational tool? The trial ended as abruptly as it began. The feathered man lowered his head, then turned away. The elder explained, "You are permitted to take what you saw in memory, but the objects remain here. If they are meant for you, the sea will return you." They descended in silence, the wind carrying the snap of the banners far out to sea. Back in the canoe, Bernard glanced upward one last time. The red cloth flared against the sky, its movement like a heartbeat, steady, enduring. As they paddled southward once more, the shoreline shifted from sheer cliffs to low, jungle-covered slopes. Somewhere ahead, beyond the dense green, lay the ruins the elder had spoken of, stone steps that rose into the clouds, and secrets older than both their worlds. The shoreline fell away behind them, swallowed by the humid breath of the jungle. The canoe nosed into a narrow river mouth, the current slow and heavy, its surface broken by tangles of roots that plunged deep into the black water. The elder's paddle dipped soundlessly, each stroke deliberate, as if he knew the river's mood could turn without warning. The air grew thick, green, alive with the hum of insects and the distant cries of unseen birds. Sunlight filtered through a lattice of leaves, casting shifting patterns on Bernard's face. Somewhere ahead, the elder had promised, stood a stone that remembered both the first people and the strangers who came from across the sea. The river tightened into a corridor between walls of mangrove. From time to time, Bernard glimpsed ancient steps buried in moss, just visible above the waterline. They belonged to no living settlement. These were the remnants of something swallowed by centuries. One step bore a faint spiral, another a faint groove shaped like the arm of the twin cross. Quirky detail. A troop of spider monkeys shadowed them along the branches, occasionally dropping small fruits into the water as if to test whether the intruders would eat. One landed squarely in Bernard's lap. He looked up, and the largest monkey, its fur patchy with age, tilted its head like a questioning elder. The current slackened as they entered a wide basin. At its center rose a mound of stone, only the top visible above the water. The elder beached the canoe at the mound's base, where a crumbling stairway climbed into the shadows of towering ceiba trees. Their roots gripped the stone like clenched fists, forcing it apart yet somehow holding it together. At the summit, surrounded by fallen blocks and leaf litter, stood the stela. Taller than 3 men, it leaned slightly, as though burdened by the stories it carried. Its surface was divided into 2 panels, one carved in the unmistakable angular script of the Maya, the other in shallow, looping letters that Bernard recognized from the margins of medieval Latin texts. Historical fact. Some Maya stelae were known to record not only dates and rulers, but also celestial events and foreign visitors. Archaeologists have found glyphs describing strangers arriving by sea, though identities remain debated. The Maya panel depicted a ship with square sails, caught in curling waves. Beneath it, a cluster of human figures, some with feathered headdresses, others with long tunics, stood in a semicircle. In the sky above, a constellation blazed, its central star marked with an elaborate cross. The Latin panel, weathered almost to illegibility, bore fragments of a phrase, or mare ignotum, through an unknown sea. Bernard's hand traced the seam where the 2 scripts met. Was this a collaborative record, or had one culture overwritten the other's tale? The commander circled the stela, noting a series of shallow holes around its base. These could have anchored something, he murmured. Banners? Ropes? Bernard remembered the red banners on the cliff and felt a prickling at the base of his neck. At the back of the stela, half hidden by moss, they found a small recess. Inside lay objects sealed in hardened resin, a length of twisted thread dyed blue, a corn cob wrapped in palm fiber, and a copper coin. The coin's design was unfamiliar. One side bore a cross with flared arms, the other a stylized turtle. Debated question: if this coin belonged to the Templars, why was it left here rather than taken back across the sea? Could it have been a deliberate marker for those who might follow? The elder knelt before the stela and touched his forehead to the stone. He set a pinch of salt beside a wrapped ear of maize at the base. Trade turned into treaty, simple grain speaking longer than any oath. This place, he said softly, is where the old paths cross. The sea people came, and some stayed. Others left, carrying seeds and words. He looked at Bernard. The jungle remembers, even when men forget. A sudden movement in the undergrowth drew their eyes. A figure stepped into the clearing, a young woman in a tunic of woven reeds, her hair bound with red thread. She held a basket of small clay tablets, each incised with symbols. Without a word, she offered one to Bernard. It depicted the same constellation from the mural on the cliff, but here the stars were joined by a winding line that ended in a turtle shape. Quirky connection. The winding line resembled the river's course from the sea to this very basin. Could the map have been hidden in plain sight, disguised as myth? The woman pointed to the east, toward a wall of jungle. Stone Road, the elder translated, leads to the place of 2 suns. The commander's eyes narrowed. 2 suns? Eclipse? Bernard thought of the astronomical alignments hinted at in the banner pole's notches. Perhaps the journey was leading them toward a place where heaven and earth met. They left the stela reluctantly, the jungle already beginning to reclaim their footprints. As they descended the mound, Bernard glanced back and imagined the stone centuries from now, still leaning, still bearing its double-voiced message, while the world around it changed and forgot. The stone road awaited them, hidden under layers of leaf fall and silence. If it truly led to the place of two suns, then what they found there might not only rewrite their own story, but that of both worlds. The jungle path bled into stone. It was not a road in the way the old world imagined, but a ribbon of fitted blocks, their surfaces smoothed by centuries of bare feet and rain. Roots arched over it like ribs, vines trailed down like curtains, and every step forward was a step deeper into a place where time did not march. It circled. They walked until the light began to change. The canopy opened above a clearing, and there it was, a platform of pale limestone, its edges sharp despite the years, flanked by two towering stelae. Upon each stela was carved the same constellation they'd seen before, the cross of stars. But here it was, doubled, side by side, as if two suns had risen in the same sky. The elder stood still, his gaze distant. When the shadow of one star touches the other, he said, the world changes. Bernard realized he was speaking not just of astronomy, but of history, two worlds brushing together in a moment that could not be undone. Historical fact: the Maya tracked solar eclipses with astonishing precision, aligning temples and monuments to mark the event. For them, an eclipse was not an interruption of the sun's journey, but a dialogue between the sun and the moon, a sign that worlds, visible and invisible, were in contact. At the center of the platform lay a single slab, fitted so tightly that not even a blade could slip between it and its neighbors. The commander knelt, brushing away a thin layer of soil. Symbols emerged: a ship, a cross, a turtle. Between them, a winding line that curved in the same pattern as the river they had traveled. Bernard felt the skin at his neck tighten. They lifted the slab. Beneath it was a cavity lined with cedar, miraculously preserved by resin and stone. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in red-dyed cotton. The elder unwrapped it with slow, reverent hands. First came a scroll, its vellum browned but supple, written in a hand Bernard recognized from medieval charters. He read aloud, "We crossed a sea without name. We found land beyond the reach of kings. Here we leave this record, that our brothers may know the path, should God call them to follow." Then, a small leather pouch. Inside were seeds, maize, cacao, and something Bernard could not name. The elder took one between thumb and forefinger. "These," he said, "are no longer grown here. They came from the north, long ago." Quirky detail: a carved wooden game ball, no bigger than an apple, sat in the bundle. Its surface was etched with both Maya glyphs and tiny Latin letters. Bernard rolled it in a palm, imagining it as a token of shared games, shared language, an artifact of people who had not just traded goods, but lives. Debated question: could a fragment of the Templar order truly have crossed the Atlantic a century before Columbus? Some would call it impossible. Others would point to the currents, the drift patterns, the known Norse voyages, and say it was only improbable until now. The commander stared at the scroll for a long time before folding it again. "If we bring this back," he said, "we will not be believed. It will be called a forgery, a hoax." Bernard looked past him at the jungle pressing close. "And if we leave it here, it will vanish. The jungle will eat it, and the story will sleep again." The elder touched the scroll, then the seeds. "The story does not sleep. It grows, sometimes slowly, under the earth, until the day it finds the sun again. They rewrapped the bundle, sealing it back into its stone cradle. The commander made no protest. Some truths, they all seemed to understand, were not meant to be carried away. As they left the clearing, the light shifted, the sun slipping behind a high, thin cloud. Bernard glanced back once. In that instant, the two stelae seemed to merge, the carved suns touching in perfect eclipse. It was not proof, but it was enough. By the time they reached the coast, the tide was rising. Their ship lay at anchor, rocking gently, its masts like crosses against the reddening sky. Bernard paused on the sand, the elder's words echoing in his mind. If even a handful of the Templars had reached this place, leaving their marks in stone and seed, then the neat boundaries of the known world were illusions. Historical fact: there are maps from the 14th and 15th centuries that show coastlines far more accurate than official exploration would allow. Whether born of rumor, lost voyages, or deliberate secrecy, they hint that the story of the oceans is not yet fully told. They set sail at dawn, the jungle shrinking into a green haze. Bernard kept the memory of the stela, the scroll, the seeds. Though they had left them behind, they weighed on him like ballast. And somewhere deep in the hold, wrapped in oilcloth, was the small, carved ball. He told no one he had kept it. As the wind filled the sails, Bernard stood at the rail. The ocean was vast, but it no longer felt unknowable. It was a bridge, not a wall, and he could not help but wonder how many other crossings lay hidden beneath its waves, waiting for their stories to surface. Let the scroll rest in its cedar cradle. Let the seeds wait for a season that may never come. Let the stone suns stand in the jungle, their shadows touching once every age. Sleep well. For tonight, you have walked on a road between worlds and heard the whisper of a history that might yet be true.